Hello and welcome to this edition of Sartor TV. I'm Tracy Fitzpatrick. Our guest today is author and global growth guru Brian Barnier. Currently, he is a director at Value Bridge Advisors, specializing in risk management and corporate growth. He's penned hundreds of articles, is a sought-after speaker, and the author of the Operational Risk Handbook, the topic of our discussion today. Brian, thanks so much for being here.
Pleased to be here.
Well, I must say your book was thoughtful, insightful, and a definite workout on the left brain hemisphere. So, Brian, what is the overall theme of the book?
It's about achieving real things in the real world. It's about managing risk to performance. It's not just compliance and paperwork.
So what makes your book different than other books based on this operational risk approach?
It's this performance thing. In some ways, it's very old school. In some ways, it's very new school. Because in a world where we get sort of tied up in knots, we forget why are we actually doing something. And we're doing it to achieve an objective. And with that objective, just like in sports or anything, riding your bike, there's some risk involved. And in order to manage that risk, we just have to ask two questions. We have to learn something. And that's, how does it work and what if?
And people talk a lot about risk and uncertainty. What is the real difference between the two?
Huge difference in this. One is about something that you can sort of predict to know and you can do some math around. That's the risk part. It's like there's 52 cards in a deck, and if you're playing a game, you can do some probabilities. The other one is we don't know. It's truly a game of chance. It's like the Super Bowl, right? What's going to happen? And that brings in the uncertainty. And then, of course, the danger is when people confuse those two. Because then they look at something like, say, trains that run pretty regular and you can almost set your watch by them, but then something happens, a snowstorm, an accident, whatever it is, and the whole system gets thrown out of whack. And they got lulled into complacency because they thought it was about 52 cards in a deck and risk, but it was really about the Super Bowl.
So why does this risk uncertainty difference matter?
Because without it, you then no longer have the ability to avoid those kinds of problems that are really arising out of uncertainty, and you can't do the math right around the risk. And where that plays out, for example, are things in financial markets, where we had like the long-term capital meltdown, which was really all about the fact that they thought certain ratios behaved in a certain way following a standard normal distribution, and they didn't. I thought it was fascinating during the Super Bowl. People were out there web searching what was the greatest comeback in all history just before halftime, right? Well, that was shattered, just like so many other things that we see in science and happening around the world.
And we were talking about left brain, right brain. Now, did math science come easily to you? And what about the kids out there that are saying, I'm just not good at it? Is there hope for late bloomers, someone that can appreciate your book down the road?
Actually, it didn't. But that was because of sort of the right brain, left brain thing, right? My teachers always taught it to me as, here's a series of equations, do them. And it wasn't until a couple of great professors in college that actually talked about how does it work. And once somebody started explaining what's behind these calculations, then my whole world changed. And then when I got to be a professor, I sat and looked at these books that were teaching, again, things like a technician. You know, like somebody takes your blood pressure without understanding how your heart works. And so they don't know there's multiple reasons your heart could be racing and how to interpret a blood pressure reading. So that's the difference. How does it work? That's just so crucial over and over again. And it's learning.
Chapter 1, your book talks a lot about looming risk. Tell us, what do people miss? Why do they miss this looming risk, and what exactly is it?
So there's all kinds of looming risks that are out there, and they tend to result more from the uncertainty side than from the risk side. And of course, confusing the two, as we've already discussed, which is why that distinction right up front was so important. But here's the kind of situation where you've got a element that's brewing and that people aren't seeing it. It's standing there looking at right on, because they don't perceive it through a normal lens. They don't know what's going on, right? Look at the financial markets today, and people are loving and hating the Federal Open Market Committee's bubble, right? The Fed gave us the biggest bubble in history, bar none, bigger than the tech bubble. So for some people, it's great. You know, for everybody that was all in, big, huge ride up. But then you've got to worry about under what conditions does a fall occur? And is it going to be fast, or is it going to be slow, just tapering off as the mortgage bonds and the treasuries mature? We don't know. And so it's those two pieces that put it together. The uncertainty is the piece we don't know. The risk piece is we watched it march up, and we saw sort of the volatility that went with it.
And what are the catalysts of risk?
Change, complexity, and fatigue. Anything you do in sports, in aviation, just sitting here in individual communications, or all the tech equipment that's here in your great studio today. It's change, complexity, and fatigue, right? The faster things happen, the more you drive risk. The more complex they are, the more you drive risk. And then if you and I were to get tired, or if a piece of equipment, under the streets, power were to fatigue and to be damaged, all those are the three things. So no matter what you're doing in the world, change, complexity, and fatigue are the three things you really want to measure in order to evaluate risk or uncertainty.
You're right that few risks are truly new in the world. Now, why is that, and what does it mean about spotting risk well in advance?
So as human beings, this is back to your brain thing, right? There's a lot of brain science in this. We make a lot of mistakes. Our brains trick us, right? It's why magic works. I mean, one of my college buddies is Franz Harari. Great illusionist, go watch him online, fantastic stuff. And he actually gives interviews where he talks about the brain science between illusions and how the movements, what he's just doing is tricking your brain into seeing what it wants to see that isn't really there. So when we talk about missing risks, it's because our brains are outpacing us from seeing it. They want to repeat certain patterns in the past. They want to look for that to occur, whether it really does or doesn't. So we have the brain science piece going. Then we get biased by our tools. So the software we use for risk management. We use that piece of software, and if it's not pre-programmed into the software, it doesn't exist. Our brains are too tired to go outside of that. And that's what we talk about, are you situationally aware? The player on the field, are they situationally aware of what's really around them, or are they going to miss the player that's getting in position to go for the long downfield pass, or the open net soccer or world football shot? That situational awareness is something we have to train our brains to do so that we can really get ahead of that. I mean, and just a great example from me, right? I talk about this stuff. I wrote a book about it, right? One day I'm sitting at my house, and we're in sort of a wooded area, and I walk to the mailbox, which is like 250 feet. I'm on the phone. I'm walking down to the mailbox to get the mail. And having a conversation, global phone call, very powerful stuff, right? I get to the mailbox. I turn around. I look up at the house. Between me and the house is now a 600-pound black bear, which I had to have walked past, right? How could I have been oblivious to a 600-pound black bear? Well, I later looked where he was, and I could see his paw prints, and he was sort of partially covered by some rocks. And he must not have come out until I passed. But I still, if I looked, I would have seen his ears, I'd have seen his snout, I'd have seen something, but I was oblivious, right? And so every time that you've got an accident or you're looking at an after game and you're watching some player going, well, I didn't see him coming, or the sun blinded me, or whatever it was, right? That's a lack of situational awareness. We have to proactively cultivate that. And that's a lot about what you do here with Starter TV in terms of stressing learning. Because you first of all have to learn the skill, and then you actually have to do it.
You use the 5+2 step cycle to illustrate how to evaluate and respond to risk. What is it, and why is it important?
So the 5+2 step cycle, the 5 are the pieces that we go through in sort of a steady state, right? So we want to understand the environment that we're in and what our capabilities are. That's step 1, and we call know the business. How does it work? Step 2 is we talk about seeking scenarios. And that is understanding the what if, asking the question, right? And if you don't understand how it works, you can't ask what if, right? If you don't understand how a car works, you have no idea about brakes. Think about the first time you're on an icy road. So you get into trouble. So the second one is seek scenarios or what if. Then we watch for warning signs. And again, if you don't know how it works and you haven't asked what if, you're in trouble. Again, in our wooded area, my kids have an archery target set up. One day, I'm sitting there on a phone call, working at home. Yay, I'm home. I look out the front window. There's a little fawn between the front window and the kid's archery target. It has no idea. It's all perfectly lined up, right? And so it lacks situational awareness of what's going on. But it doesn't know the warning signs. And we see the same kind of thing in industrial accidents where people didn't know how to respond to all the warning indicators. Or think about being in an ICU with a loved one and all these beepers start going off. You don't know if that's imminent death or just some button that the nurse has to push to, every 5 minutes to, let them know a human being's there. So then we go in from there, those 3 steps of risk evaluation. Then we've got 2 more. They're in the response section. And one is we have to prioritize, which you can only do based upon all those other 3. And too many people try to prioritize too early. And then the 5th step is the 2 things that we do to respond to risk, which is either change our position in the environment or strengthen our capabilities. So those are the 5 things that we do on sort of a normal basis, round and over and over and over again. And then the +2 are the things we do in the middle, which is when a bad thing happens, then we have to respond and then we have to recover.
Now, how is this cycle different from other cycles?
Right, so several different ways. First of all, this cycle separates risk program management from actually doing risk. Everything I just talked about is an active driving thing. We've got another cycle that runs around it that's about managing the program. Lots of other cycles and books and materials you'll see mix those up, so it's very confusing. It's like, you got to have a risk, matrix thing or a framework or whatever. Those are all program management steps. So not actually managing risk, right? The second thing that we do that makes this very different is this is rooted in decades of proven practice. For those people who think this sounds a little bit familiar, it is, because what I'm really basing it on is Deming's 4-step cycle. I just broke 2 of his boxes out to add a little bit more emphasis for risk. That Deming, and Deming, by the way, credits a guy by the name of Walter Short with creating it, that is in so many different disciplines. So almost everything you see out there is based on his plan, do, study, act piece. And then the next way is that because I've taken and harmonized it across a bunch of different areas, it's so much easier to explain and to implement for other people, whereas a lot of these things are so proprietary to our little professional discipline thing. Nobody else gets what you're talking about. And it's back to your initial impression of right brain, left brain reading the book, right? I mean, you're a finance person, you got no idea what this operationally wonky thing is, or human resources or marketing or sales or whatever.
Okay, you call scenario analysis the heart of risk management. So what is this and why is it really so important?
Yeah, so scenario analysis is that asking what if. And one of the great ways to illustrate this is, for anybody who's been a movie buff out there or a sports buff, and if you love movies and you watch that director stuff on the end of your DVDs or Blu-rays, or if you watch the sports afterwards and people are talking about, well, what could they have done differently? Or these like History Channel buffs that watch the great military battles of history and sort of armchair quarterback. That's what this what-ifing stuff is about. It's understanding what could arise, what has arisen in the past that surprised people, how to learn from those issues, and then how to carry that forward to apply it where we're going. So it's a process, but then there's also individual illustrations. And sometimes I try to play dad while I'm doing work, for example. There's all these kids' movies out there that repeatedly teach this. If you've seen, How to Train Your Dragon, the little kid sits back and looks at the dragon and says, everything we thought we knew about you was wrong. The movie Croods, they come out of the cave, right? Everything we thought we knew about the world was wrong. I mean, and you take it into epic things like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Everything they thought they knew outside of the Shire was wrong. And we see that theme repeated over and over and over again, whether it's this year's Super Bowl or all these, things from, the literary world or military battles. All these military doctrines they had. Think about everything that got crushed in World War I and World War II, and all the horrible battles and losses that took place because people were out of step. That's why scenario analysis, asking what if, is the absolute beating, living heart of risk management. If that's not done right, everything else fails.
Now, can you share an example with us where this did actually make a difference?
I mean, they're all over the place. Let me give some that are more complex. So let me go to a techie person first, since we were talking about that earlier on. And it's about computer systems. And people sit back and say, well, why did that fail? And it's because they didn't understand how the system actually worked. Sometimes it wasn't because they were documented. Sometimes people didn't take the time. But you look at why was there a systems outage? Well, nobody knew that, somebody had moved something in the data center, and because that was moved in the data center, a particular cable no longer went where it went before. Maybe it wasn't connected to a backup unit, or that backup unit wasn't connecting to it, and therefore you had a failure that was horrible. I mean, some of these are really silly. Like I had one local data center storage thing that failed only because somebody they were storing it in the physical data center. They had multiple backups on a pizza box server rack. And then they had the cleaning staff that would come in and they would clean the floor, the nice computer floor, bright and shiny, with one of those big orbital cleaners, right? Well, what do you got going in that big orbital cleaner? You got a big electric motor. What does that do off? It throws off an electric field. What is static data storage not like? Electric fields. So they had raced their backups in an effort to keep the data center clean, right? Nobody stopped to ask, how does it work? You know, not too many blocks of us here. I was with a company and they, big bank, and they showed me their data center diagrams. And we got to this thing and literally they actually said this, and this is a black box. What do you mean it's a black? Well, it was an acquisition. We really don't know how it works. At least nobody on our team does. And that's, an example of it. So if you don't know how it works and you can't ask what if, you're just doomed.
Now, what is lost if robust scenario analysis isn't used?
Right. So once you lose that scenario analysis, then you're in trouble. And there's actually a couple of ways that you can lose the scenario analysis. One I call sort of phantom scenarios, where people go through the motions of doing scenarios because it's what the regulators want to see. And they're these very thin, lightweight things that really aren't very challenging. They don't dig into the what if, so they're really in trouble. They're really not servicing. They're going through the motions. The other ones, on the other end of the spectrum, I call more like a Harry Potter, kind of scenario, because there they think that magic's going to happen. And they dig deeply into a scenario, and it's like, troll in the dungeon, right? They dig so big, and everybody is distracted by the troll in the dungeon, and they're not watching what's going on. Or it's back to my magician friend, Franz Harari, right? They focus huge amounts of attention on a few scenarios and say, well, we're going to do a really good job with a couple this year. Maybe next year we'll do another couple. And they're completely blinded by everything going off in their organization. That's why there's a particular technique in the book. I spent 2 chapters walking through it. I'm actually teaching a workshop on it coming up in 2 weeks to walk through how to do this technique that's very efficient and effective, to do lots of scenarios and to build it into the organizational fabric, so that it's not something that some risk team has to do, but real people can do all the time, which is where risk management really happens, at the coalface, we say.
Now, is there a distinction between strategic, operational, and credit market risk?
For banking regulators, and in some other industries, insurance and others, there's very specific pieces, very different toolkits and math and processes that go with it. Here's the problem with that, is that they're really much more connected. Because when we look at all this, underlying them, everything's part of a system, right? So when we look at, say, market risk, and we're looking at price levels sort of bobbing around on the surface, like my point before, as long as you're in that little range, then you can go calculate certain volatility measures with a bunch of well-known ratios, and you're kind of sort of okay, and you can debate the nuances of the ratios. But as soon as something unusual happens, right, in the macro environment, a geopolitical issue, the Federal Reserve or a central bank someplace else in the world, or this mountain of debt we've got from a variety of consumer and government and business sources, everything gets wiped out. That's totally blown away. That goes into the world of operational risk, the scenarios and the root cause and the systems. So there's this perception that they're a lot more different than they are. And the reality is that they're all linked together by real, tangible operating things.
Now, in addition to your scenario analysis, you emphasize systems and root cause analysis. What are they and why are they so important?
Right, so I mean, that's perfect takeoff, great question to where we were just a moment ago. So when you look at systems, you want to see how everything's related to each other, right? I mean, you're on a train network, you're on a road network, you're on an airplane network, you're doing IT networks, the Sarder TV community, these are all systems of living, breathing people and stuff that are experiencing change, complexity, and fatigue. An easy way to think about it is, a screensaver with all those little bubbles in them. And each bubble is sort of happily living in its own world, or Horton hears a Who, and it thinks that Whoville thinks all that there is what there is. And you don't know that there's this great universe out there, and that every once in a while, 2 of those bubbles collide, and then all heck breaks loose, right? And so understanding the systems is vital to be able to understanding boundary conditions, whether it's mathematically or for doing what if and scenario analysis, or actually looking what could reverberate through the system. Then root cause sits back and says, why is what we see actually there? An example, say you're out on a boat and you're bobbing along in your boat and you're looking at the waves, and you might see a wave that's sort of going up and down. And in our brains, we get tricked into thinking that, well, whatever that is like me moving my hand and that same pattern's repeating. But in reality, it's coming from the intersection of a whole bunch of things, boats and swimmers and wind and everything that's going on that lake that's making that piece of, and everything under the water that's making that bob and rise and fall, the tidal effect and everything. So unless we're dealing in a world of systems and root cause, we're completely blind to what's going on. And whether it's an operational risk, market risk, any risk, as long as we're just dealing with the surface of these loss distributions and stuff, we're completely blind to that whole root cause and the systems that are causing those losses.
Okay, pattern analysis. What is it and how can people successfully apply it?
So we're going right in from that wave analogy and carrying that one step further. What is different, what's different about this kind of pattern analysis that we're talking about is that it's not one that allows our brains to be tricked. Because a lot of people, pattern analysis is really a bad thing. It's what happened to me before. It's like, we got the basketball arena nearby. It's, a player makes a shot and you think you're going to keep making more shots, the hot hand fallacy, or the piece about the Super Bowl and the greatest comeback. It's not that kind of pattern thing. It's patterns that are informed by how does it work and what if. That allows us to see these combinations of warning signs for what they really are, recognize we've got a problem and where we're going forward. So for instance, in the financial markets, when we're sitting there and some people will say, bubbles are, nobody can see a bubble, right? That's why they call it a bubble. Well, that's just not true, because we can look at bubbles relative to something else. We can look at them to some hard assets. We can look at them from cash flows, all kinds of combinations. That allows us to see a departure from something that's tangibly connected. And if we're looking at whether it's credit card losses or whether we're looking at data center failures, any of those things in operational risk, it's all about what is it connected to. And that's why pattern analysis matters, because it gives us early warning so we're not surprised by those events that come along.
Your toolkit includes a range of other techniques and math, but then you shift and look at the human brains and bias. Why this emphasis, and how do people underestimate this type of thing with risks?
It's really to the point that you made at the outset. I mean, it's a brain thing, like you were opening up by saying. We go through all this math and we go through the scenarios and the root cause. And when I'm walking through workshops with people, when I'm going through and doing post-incident diagnoses and saying what happened here, so much of it turns out to be the brain things, right? It turns out that there are these formal, well-documented biases. A lot of the research in this area comes out of the public health space. I mean, why do people substance abuse or are alcoholics or all these sorts of issues? Unsafe driving, texting while you're in your car. All of those kinds of things add up and carry over into the professional space as well. I mean, Kim Rossmo is a professor down at Texas State who's written about criminal investigators. Why do people pursuing a serial killer, why do police officers pursue the wrong suspect? In the face of evidence that tells them that they are pursuing the wrong, they're engaging what's called confirmation bias. They look at everything that happens and they use that to confirm the suspect that they're already chasing. And it's not until several more bodies pile up with that person under clear surveillance that they go, maybe we got the wrong person that we're after, tracing. And so these kinds of deeply rooted biases, just like the train schedule and others we talked about, take on a whole huge life. And risk managers who try to come at this from a purely quantitative perspective make two errors. One, they're looking at just risk. They're not looking at the uncertainty that your question asked about before. And second, they're not looking about how the human brain is completely messing up this. And that's why learning becomes so important in what you're doing here at Cider TV, because you have to recognize that I am subject to these biases and then find a way to overcome them.
Does the process for managing risk need to be deeply complex to spot even greater risks?
That is a fantastic question. That is sort of like one of the all-time questions and one of the big debates that's going out there today, especially in like banking risk, where there's all these complex regulations that are there.
And do people really understand them all? Is that another issue?
Yeah, I mean, people don't understand them. Even when they're being implemented, they don't. I mean, look at the news stories you see where, say, the New York Fed, says one thing to a bank, and then the Federal Reserve Board of Governors comes in and says something else, or the OCC and the Federal Reserve, and they're all working to get on the same page with each other. The issue here is that there's this perception that you need something incredibly complex. And it turns out that when you add a complex risk management process on top of a complex real world, You're increasing your complexity. And remember, what are our three catalysts of risk? Change, complexity, and fatigue. You've just increased that complexity factor. You've increased risk. So risk that is more effective is risk that is simple, so that everybody can implement it. It is risk that is humble, at appreciating what you don't know and understand about the world. And it is risk is a process that gives you margin, right? It's just like having inventory buffer levels in stores, right? So you're not running everything to the last just-in-time inventory level or the last carton of milk, tracked by barcodes. So a simpler process is often far, far more effective because mathematically it reduces the complexity factor. And then back to your human brain, great question, it makes it easier for more people to implement so you can do it at the coalface. It's not something that's stuck with just some risk management team. It is something that everybody can do, and that then these phrases we toss around about risk is everybody's job really becomes a reality. So complex risk management tends to increase risk, very bad, and we try to fight that every place we can.
Now, why do people fail to act when it does come to risk?
So you're bringing together a lot of these good points that you've already raised, right? So we've got these human brain biases. We'll start there. I mean, it's these famous experiments that go back years. I mean, why was a woman murdered in the alley and nobody came to her rescue, right? I mean, why does, the "not my job," phrase so popular, right? It's because, we cut people off. And that's one of the great dangers in the sense of ops risk, and particularly a regulatory flavor that uses controls. One of the many reasons why controls are so bad, because they create this sense of, it's not my job. Somebody else will do it. The checkers checking syndrome just passes it on to somebody else. Furthermore, you slice and dice a process and you can't see to the end of it. All right, so people don't understand what the outcome is supposed to be. Oh, you mean we're supposed to be scoring touchdowns? I thought we were just supposed to be looking good for the cameras. Or I thought we were supposed to go, 1 yard. Or I thought we were, you slice and dice things. Just think about if a team didn't all see the big picture and they just had one little individual bit of coaching. So that's where we get into these difficulties of why people don't see the risk. And there's just, item after item. A great book from another author is Michelle Worker's The Gray Rhino, where she spends a lot of time talking about this. So we've got a set of psychological reasons, where it's the formal bias, as well as the more informal aspects. We've got math errors that are just infectious out there. People doing math as technicians without the understanding of the why. Again, your great question from the beginning. And then we've got the issue of these software tools that cut us off from seeing the big picture because we only do with what's in our tool, and it creates a prison. Then we've got organizational silos, and you get sort of the idea of where I'm going. Everything that slices and dices us and puts us through a chopper, everything that blinds us, everything that causes structural blindness in a big sense, just causes us to miss things right and left, like me and the bear.
Okay, multifaceted question. Keep your brain working. Many people think of risk response actions as transfer, mitigate, accept, and such. You don't. You see it just two, and very different two at that. What and why are they?
So
That's a complex question.
but it fits the point. Why risk management is too complex, and why it fails, and why risk management that's complex adds complexity, which increases risk rather than decreases it, right? So those pieces those words that you're using really come out of the insurance industry. And it's like, I'm your insurance agent, and you're the operating company, and you're going to sit back and say, what can you do for me? And I'm going to say, well, if you suffer a loss, you can transfer that part to me and I'll write a check for you, right? But in reality, in the world, you can't. You're stuck with the risk. All you can do is reduce part of the financial consequences. Your burning building can still burn down. All I'm going to do is write you a check, after your deductible and up to your limits. That's it. So the real risk you have, and that's not going to go away. Even if you shut down a business, we know the crafty attorneys are going to come chasing you with residual liabilities for years, right? So here we do just two things. One, change your position in the environment. Two, improve your capabilities. And again, let's go back to sports, right? You can either get clear so you can get the pass. You see that all the time in football plays. Or two, you can become bigger, faster, stronger so you can blast through whoever else is trying to tackle you or intercept. Right? Those are the only two things you can do. And you've got to work with those. Now there's subsets of each one of those. But you see it in aviation, right? Or you turn on like the Weather Channel and you see them flying through the eye of the hurricane, right? They want to be in, the danger zone, makes good TV, but they've got a plane that's capable of it. You're not going to fly your little whatever through the hurricane. And by the way, they're not going to fly through the more dangerous parts of the hurricane. That's a shift. So we simplify it down to change your position in the environment and strengthen your capabilities. Those are the two things you do, and then we've got different levers to push to make that happen. All that other complexity, first of all, it's distracting. Second of all, in some cases, it's not good advice. And then third of all, it just adds complexity.
So in order to strengthen organization capabilities and to better respond to risk, you describe 4 different ways. So what are they and why are they so helpful?
So the capabilities we put into 4 buckets. Different people write these different ways. One, we talk about sort of governance, or some people use the word oversight. But from the board of directors, or maybe some corporate-wide team that's coming down, that's setting the context and enabling other people to be successful. And again, huge difference in what we're talking about here. That's a performance-driven approach versus a compliance-driven approach. In the compliance-driven approach, all that oversight is, did you check all these boxes? In the performance approach, it's, how did you help us achieve the strategy? How did you execute on strategy? How did you create more strategic options for us than we had before? Why do sports coaches recruit, right? Because they want players that will give them more options that they can then use in their plays, right? You used to have just big guys on a defensive line, right? Then you got big guys that were smart, right? And you started creating new roles for defensive linebackers, for example. And then you got them that were fast too. So now you're out there recruiting these kids in junior high and high school that have the right genetic predisposition, and then you're following them all through and signing them to contracts. So oversight, then management, good business school type stuff, your favorite case studies, whatever that is. I don't want to, my alma mater is Michigan, go blue, but don't want to pick one school over the other here. And then we come into fixing the core business process, which is good business process improvement, good literature on that. And then only after that, we've got actual controls. So all these paperwork controls we throw away, and the only controls that we have are the controls that work like a light switch. Reliably, perfectly, every time, whether it's you and I that's implementing them. If we're both flying a Boeing 737-whatever, we're both going to do exactly the same thing to be good pilots. And the avionics and everything's going to work exactly the same on that airplane. So those are the ones we keep. All those paperwork controls that are wasteful and distracting, we throw away.
Okay, now, how is cost-benefit analysis different when applied to risk management within an organization?
Right, so this changes a lot, and it becomes actually a big issue in what's going on. So many people, first of all, look at risk management and they look at it sort of at overhead because they're looking at it as a compliance-driven approach. When we're taking a performance-driven approach, it's entirely different now, right? Because now we're trying to achieve a set of objectives. We're actually trying to win a football game, win a battle, launch a better product and get higher adoption rates and more consumer success and more awards for whatever the thing is we've got. And once that's done, now we shift to looking at things in 2 ways. First of all, that risk management is helping us actually cut cost. And that's why risk is sort of a kissing cousin of quality, and Philip Crosby wrote this great book, Quality is Free. So risk management is free when it's being done for performance. Yes, you still got to hit for the compliance piece, but it should be free and relatively costless. The second thing is you really switch from thinking about cost benefit into a risk return calculation, which is much more crisp and much more clear what we're after. But it's only enabled once you think about risk in a performance-driven approach.
Okay, how do you talk about the risk response knowledge chart in the book, and how do you engage employees?
Yeah, so this is one I developed years ago, and it was just a quick thing I originally did on a whiteboard. I was in somebody's office, and it turned out that it really worked, and you just sort of keep what works, right?
The aha moment, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's like a comedian. I mean, if the joke works, keep it, you don't cut funny. So here I drew out 2 axes, and I said on one axis, I said, how much do you know about these risks that we're talking about? And the other axis, I just said, how much do you know about the response? What you would do if one of these things materialized. And it turns out that you do a little 2x2 off of this, and it's a very useful way to discuss things. Because in one corner, you've got things that you know a lot about, but you really don't know what you're going to do about. So first of all, you've got to develop plans. But because you know something about them, it's going to be easier to develop a response plan. And then we've got over in the other corner things where we've got sort of generic responses, but we really know very little about the risks, which means generic response better work and there's some chances that we can get surprised because our generic preparedness is not going to help us. Like say when a fire department has a very unusual chemical fire in an industrial building. They've got a general idea of what they're going to do, but they haven't had that mixed together, and so they're going to hit some variation. If you know both, well, that's goodness, right? Because then you're both aware and you're prepared. That's where we want to move people. And then down here, these are what we call the big scaries. We're down in the big scaries, those are the ones that we really need to prioritize.
Now, what is the best way for a company to limit its exposure to fraud?
So fraud, the big issue there is actually pretty simple, is that most people aren't doing fraud prevention. What they're doing is early detection in preparation for litigation. There's a whole other set of methodology based upon this. We've got a whole chapter in the book that's really about getting ahead of it. Because once you understand how it works and the what if, now you can get way ahead of these things. It turns out, for example, that most frauds are really exploits in product processes. Almost nobody is evaluating their product processes and having a fraud person sit on new product development teams. But it turns out, once you understand those processes, then not only can you develop a better product, you're usually getting better customer service, better sales training, all kinds of things. You know your customer pieces, all come together, you save a huge amount of costs, and you're way up front in avoiding the fraud.
Are financial institutions overly dependent on IT, and do you see this trend growing?
Well, I mean, they're dependent, right? The whole world's dependent on IT, and it's going to only go more. The big danger is that without asking what if, and in order to ask what if, you have to be able to say, how does it work? They're going to be increasing danger from a risk perspective. So it's that knowledge gap, it's that failure to learn gap that is the big scary there, rather than the IT.
Okay. Give us a quick overview of the best way a company can respond to risk and to improve their overall business performance.
Yeah, so it really comes back to that where you are in your environment and strengthening your capabilities. And that goes into the strategic analysis, competitive analysis, the market analysis, and that's what's hugely missing from operational risk. So when I do these risk workshops, I used to try to jump into risk, and then almost 10 years ago, I sat back and said, no, we need a whole day one for our 20 to 30 person team that's going to be together doing this, and we're going to walk through the whole business, whatever our relevant areas that we've selected, and we're going to start with what's the market, what are the customers, what are our competitors, what's the regulatory environment, what's happening with the technology, big trends, product-facing technology. Then we go on to our product plan. Then we go into our business processes operationally. Then we get down to our administrative technology and we see how it all works and we see how all the dependencies go. And I've never done one of these in a company of any size where people were not amazed, because it's the first time in many cases that people were taken offline to take a top to bottom look at some product or business line space. And it's just a real shock moment.
Many people try to control risk. What's the difference between controlling and actually managing the risk?
Right. So, the best way to answer this is go online and see put in risk is an illusion, control is an illusion, and you see these, sort of yogis doing their thing, right? It's not there. There is no history behind the control piece other than those controls that work like light switches that really work. And so to try to implement the controls creates all those problems that we talked about before, and that's why we focus on real management, not controls that can be dangerous and waste time.
You said that managing risk to performance pays for itself, and many people think of it just as a compliance overhead to cost. Now, why do you see this differently?
So we'll just use that to sort of put a bow on the variety of the comments earlier. When you see the world in scenarios, in systems, and root causes, everything that you do to make an improvement is a payoff. And so that's why you get, like Philip Crosby wrote years ago, quality is free, and I continue that with risk is free. The only thing that you're going to end up having as a dead weight cost is the compliance cost that you can't get out of because there's some regulators sitting there. But everything else is going to help you achieve a financial or operational customer service type objective.
In evaluating quality of managing risk, what's the difference between paperwork and performance?
That again is one of these great, sort of summary bow type points, because we spend so much time doing paperwork and we spend so much time pursuing controls that are paper controls, policies, and all these sorts of things that are just dangerously distracting, and they waste time and cost to give us a false sense of security. All that stuff just goes to the side, and instead we look at what are our financial objectives, what are our operational objectives to proceed out of that, including the things like customer service, and that lines us up. And again, we're back to quality and risk are free.
What's the most important action that board members can take in providing oversight to management? And can you explain an example of this?
That's simple. They have to set the example. When they're not asking how it works and what if, then nobody else is going to. They've got to set the example. If there's a board briefing package that comes to them, that they're going to be asking that. The corporate secretary, who's sort of the traffic cop to the board, has to look at the presentations coming up and say, does this explain how it works? Does this go through what if? And then does it walk through the appropriate responses, environment, and capabilities?
And can you think of an organization that actually has done this successfully? Give an example.
Yeah, I mean, just look at almost any successful product company that's out there that you'd be familiar with. I mean, for example, look at the improvements that have been made at Microsoft. I mean, almost everybody that's called their support service over the past 4 years knows about that. They're getting good responses to that. You can see it in automobile companies, almost everything that's consumer oriented where they're getting alignment and focusing. That's working and that's getting traction for people. Those that are not are really struggling.
In your book, you summarize with a set of touchstones. 2 are performance and agility. These are far from what many people would associate with risk management. Now, why are these 2 so important, and can you give us some real-life examples?
Yeah, it comes back to again, great way to sort of be putting a bow on this. So often, risk is thought of as controls and compliance and audit, which means it's boat hanger, it's excessive cost. As soon as you switch to performance focus, right, then now you're achieving these outcomes. Now you're achieving these objectives. You're bringing people along. And in this economic environment where the S&P 500 as a group is $1 trillion short on revenue compared to last year, that's 10% of US business GDP. That's huge. All these risk-averse companies, that's got to stop, or there's a lot of people losing jobs and a lot of more negativity for our economic environment. So that's the performance focus that all these little things add up to. And the agility is all about, back to those sports examples, right? If you can move more quickly, if you can more safely seize opportunity, now that's a great thing. But what's all that dependent on? Learning, learning, learning. If you're not going to take time to know how football works, the rule changes, everything else, if you're not going to take time to ask what if you're not going to take time to plan for the scenario, maybe even the locker room speech where you're way behind, you're dead before you even start.
What is the power of the invite and flashlight? Explain that to us a little.
Yeah, so risk managers generally don't have a lot of formal power, especially in ops risk. I mean, market risk managers can go out and say, reverse that trade, and they got more direct authority. Ops risk managers don't. But what they've got is they've got the power of the invite. Who they invite to these 20, 30-person workshops that I teach and spend 2 chapters of the book walking through, and then how they shine a light on the issues, how they illuminate issues. So it's the power of the invite and the power of the flashlight that can make risk management a really great job and a pathway to a lot of business line management jobs if you're understanding better than anybody else in the room and you are helping other people do that. And that's why the whole approach I do is like a teach people to fish kind of approach.
Brian, thank you so much for talking us through your book today.
Most welcome.
And that does it for this edition of Starter TV. We hope you enjoyed and learned something new today. Until next time, I'm Tracy Fitzpatrick. Thanks for watching.